November 1968. A young woman vanishes without a trace in the heart of Boston. No body. No witnesses. No answers. For 55 years, her family lived with a haunting question: what happened to Laura Whitmore? Then, in 2023, a forgotten note buried in police archives changes everything. One intern. One overlooked clue. And the truth that was hiding in plain sight for over half a century. This is the story of justice delayed, but never denied. Stay until the end, because what they found will shock you. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because you won't want to miss how this cold case finally broke wide open. Chapter 1, The Disappearance. November 15, 1968. Boston, Massachusetts. The afternoon sky over Boston hung heavy with charcoal clouds, threatening snow that hadn't yet fallen. The streets of the Dorchester neighborhood were quieter than usual for a Friday evening, with most residents hurrying home before the temperature dropped below freezing. The bare branches of elm trees lining Ashmont Street scraped against each other in the bitter wind, creating an eerie soundtrack to the approaching winter darkness. Laura Whitmore pulled her navy blue wool coat tighter around her slender frame as she stepped out of the Boston Public Library branch where she worked. At 27 years old, Laura was known throughout the neighborhood as the kind-faced librarian who always remembered patrons' names and never rushed anyone browsing the shelves. Her auburn hair was tucked neatly under a cream-colored knit hat, and her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. "See you Monday, Laura," called out Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, as she locked the front entrance behind them. "Have a wonderful weekend, Helen," Laura replied with a warm smile, adjusting the leather strap of her worn handbag over her shoulder. The walk from the library to Laura's apartment was exactly 14 minutes, she had timed it countless times. The route took her down Ashmont Street, past O'Malley's corner store where Mr. O'Malley always waved through the window, then left onto Geneva Avenue, and finally right onto Bowdoin Street where she rented a modest one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a brownstone building. That evening, at precisely 5:47 p.m., Laura was seen leaving the library by 3 different witnesses. Mrs. Henderson watched her walk toward Ashmont Street. Tommy Chen, a 17-year-old student returning books, held the door open for her. And Officer Patrick Sullivan, on his regular patrol route, nodded to her as she passed the corner of Ashmont and Talbot Avenue. "Cold one tonight, Miss Whitmore," Officer Sullivan remarked, his Boston accent thick and familiar. "Indeed it is, officer." "Stay warm out here," Laura responded, her voice carrying that gentle quality that made people feel immediately at ease. Those would be the last words anyone heard Laura Whitmore speak. By 7:30 p.m., when Laura hadn't arrived for her weekly Friday dinner with her parents, Margaret and Thomas Whitmore, concern began to creep in. Margaret called Laura's apartment repeatedly, letting the phone ring 20, 30 times. Nothing. Thomas assured his wife that perhaps Laura had stopped to help a friend, or maybe the buses were running late due to the weather. By 9 p.m., when Laura still hadn't called or arrived, Thomas Whitmore drove to his daughter's apartment building. The landlady, Mrs. Kowalski, let him in with a spare key. The apartment was exactly as Laura had left it that morning, breakfast dishes washed and drying by the sink, bed made with military precision, her weekend outfit laid out on the chair by the window. Everything in its place, except Laura herself. Thomas's hands trembled as he picked up the telephone in Laura's apartment and dialed the police. Detective Raymond Foster arrived at the Dorchester precinct at 10:15 p.m. to find Thomas and Margaret Whitmore sitting on a wooden bench in the lobby, clutching each other's hands. Margaret's eyes were red and swollen, though she was fighting to maintain composure. Thomas stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight that Detective Foster could see the muscles working beneath the skin. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Detective Foster. Let's talk about your daughter." Over the next hour, Detective Foster compiled a detailed profile of Laura Whitmore. She was reliable to a fault, never missed work, always punctual, called her parents every Wednesday and Sunday evening without fail. She had no boyfriend, though several young men in the neighborhood had tried to court her. She had no enemies that her parents knew of. No debts, no vices, no secrets, at least none that her parents were aware of. "My Laura is a good girl, Detective," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "She doesn't stay out late. She doesn't go to bars. She reads books and helps people find books and comes home. That's her life. Something terrible has happened. I can feel it." Detective Foster wanted to reassure her, but his 15 years on the force had taught him to trust a mother's instincts. By midnight, patrol units were canvassing the route between the library and Laura's apartment. Officers knocked on every door, spoke to every shopkeeper who might have still been working, searched every alley and vacant lot. The temperature had dropped to 23 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light snow had finally begun to fall, coating the city in a thin layer of white that would make finding any evidence exponentially harder. At 2:30 a.m., Officer James McCarthy radioed in from Geneva Avenue, his voice tense with controlled urgency. "Detective Foster, you need to get down here. We found something." Detective Foster arrived to find a small crowd of officers gathered around a narrow alley between two brick buildings, their flashlights creating dancing shadows against the walls. On the ground, partially covered by the falling snow, lay Laura Whitmore's handbag. The leather strap had been torn, and the contents were scattered across the cold pavement: a compact mirror, lipstick, a small coin purse, a library card, and a folded handkerchief with the initials LW embroidered in blue thread. But Laura herself was nowhere to be found. Detective Foster crouched down, careful not to disturb the scene, and examined each item. Everything seemed ordinary, unremarkable, the typical contents of a young woman's purse in 1968. But then, as he lifted the navy blue coat that lay crumpled nearby, something fell from the pocket. A small piece of paper, folded once. Foster unfolded it carefully. Written in pencil, in handwriting that wasn't Laura's according to her parents, were 3 lines. "Tuesday. 8 p.m. You know where. RM." Detective Foster felt his pulse quicken. This was something. A meeting. Initials. A clue. But as he stood in that freezing alley at 3 o'clock in the morning, watching the snow cover Laura Whitmore's scattered belongings, Detective Raymond Foster had no idea that this small piece of paper would remain buried in a case file for 55 years, forgotten, overlooked, and waiting for someone to finally understand what it meant. Chapter 2, The Investigation Begins, 7,000 characters. November 16, 1968. Boston Police Department, Dorchester Precinct. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick clouds hanging over Boston as Detective Raymond Foster spread crime scene photographs across his desk. He had been awake for 28 hours straight, sustained only by bitter coffee and the gnawing determination to find Laura Whitmore before it was too late. The small note with the initials RM sat in an evidence bag at the center of his workspace, taunting him with its vague simplicity. "Tell me about the note again," said Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Foster's supervisor, as he leaned against the desk with arms crossed. Webb was a stocky man in his 50s with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen too much darkness in his 30 years on the force. Foster rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "Found it in the pocket of her coat. The handwriting doesn't match Laura's, her mother confirmed that. The paper appears to be from a standard notepad, nothing distinctive. Pencil, not pen. No fingerprints that we could lift clearly. Tuesday. 8 p.m. You know where." RM Webb repeated slowly. Tuesday would have been November 12th, 3 days before she disappeared. "Do we know if she kept this appointment?" "Her parents say she was home that Tuesday evening. Had dinner with them, actually. Left their house around 9:30 p.m. and went straight home, according to their account." Webb frowned. So either she didn't go to this meeting, or she lied to her parents about where she was. The thought sat uncomfortably with Foster. Everything he had learned about Laura Whitmore suggested she wasn't the type to deceive her family. But the note existed, hidden in her coat pocket. Why keep it if it meant nothing? By noon, the Dorchester precinct had assembled a task force of 8 officers dedicated solely to finding Laura Whitmore. Her photograph, a professional portrait taken earlier that year showing her gentle smile and intelligent eyes, had been distributed to every police station, newspaper, and television station in the Boston area. The phone lines were already ringing with tips, most of them well-intentioned but ultimately useless. Detective Foster organized his team methodically. Officers McCarthy and Sullivan would re-canvass the neighborhood, this time specifically asking about anyone with the initials RM. Officers DiNardo and Chen would investigate Laura's personal life, friends, co-workers, anyone who might know about a secret relationship or meeting. Detective Sarah Brennan, one of the few female detectives in the department, would focus on Laura's routine, mapping every location she visited regularly. Foster himself would pursue the note. The Boston Public Library where Laura worked was a stately building with tall windows and the musty smell of old books that Foster found both comforting and melancholic. Helen Henderson, the head librarian, met him in her small office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Detective Foster, have you found her?" Helen's voice trembled with hope and fear. "Not yet, Mrs. Henderson. I need to ask you some questions about Laura's relationships. Did she ever mention anyone with the initials RM?" Helen's brow furrowed in concentration. "RM? Let me think. We have several regular patrons, but I can't recall anyone specific with those initials that Laura was particularly close to. What about co-workers? Staff members? Well, there's Robert Morrison, but he's 73 years old and practically deaf. I can't imagine." Helen trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the implication. Foster made a note anyway. "Anyone else? Richard Murphy? He works in the archives department downstairs. He's around Laura's age, maybe 30. Quiet fellow, keeps to himself mostly." Foster felt a small jolt of interest. Richard Murphy. Did Laura interact with him? Helen hesitated. Sometimes. Richard would come up to the circulation desk occasionally to request books for the archives. Laura always helped him. But Detective, Richard is, well, he's a bit odd, but he's harmless. I've never seen him be anything but polite." "Odd how?" "He doesn't make much eye contact. Mumbles sometimes. He's brilliant with cataloging and historical documents, but socially awkward. The kind of man who seems more comfortable with books than people." Foster closed his notebook. "Is Mr. Murphy working today?" "He called in sick this morning, actually. First time in over a year that he's missed work." The coincidence was too significant to ignore. By 3 p.m., Foster and Officer McCarthy stood outside a narrow brownstone on Bowden Street, the same street where Laura lived, just 4 buildings down. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Kowalski, fumbled with a ring of keys as he led them up to the third-floor apartment rented by Richard Murphy. Quiet tenant, Mr. Kowalski wheezed as they climbed the stairs. Pays rent on time. Never complains. Never has visitors that I know of. The apartment door opened to reveal a space that was simultaneously meticulous and unsettling. Books lined every wall, floor to ceiling, organized by subject and then alphabetically within each category. The single window was covered with heavy curtains, leaving the room dim despite the afternoon hour. A small desk sat in the corner, papers stacked in precise piles. But Richard Murphy was not there. Foster moved through the apartment carefully, noting the sparse furniture, the absence of personal photographs, the military-style bed with corners tucked so tight you could bounce a quarter off the blanket. In the bathroom, Murphy's toothbrush and razor were gone. In the bedroom closet, several hangers were empty. "He's run," McCarthy said quietly from the doorway. Foster opened the desk drawers one by one. Bills, paid and filed by date. Library cataloging notes. A journal filled with detailed observations about literature and history. And then, in the bottom drawer, a notepad, the same type of paper as the note found in Laura's coat pocket. Foster felt his heart rate accelerate. He flipped through the pages carefully. Most were blank or contained mundane reminders and lists. But near the middle of the pad, he found it, indentations on a blank page, the ghost of writing from a sheet that had been torn away. Holding the page up to the window light, Foster could make out the impressions. Tuesday. 8 p.m. "Son of a bitch," McCarthy breathed. He wrote her that note. Foster immediately radioed for a full forensics team and issued an APB for Richard Murphy. Every officer in Boston and the surrounding areas would now be looking for a quiet, 30-year-old librarian who had disappeared on the same day as Laura Whitmore. But as Foster stood in that dim apartment, surrounded by hundreds of books and the eerie silence of Richard Murphy's carefully controlled life, he felt a deep unease settling in his chest. Finding Murphy was now their top priority, but the more pressing question haunted him: was Laura still alive, and if so, how much time did they have? By evening, the Whitmore case had become front-page news. Television reporters stood outside the Dorchester precinct, their breath visible in the cold air as they delivered updates to viewers across New England. Margaret and Thomas Whitmore made a tearful plea for their daughter's safe return, their faces haggard with exhaustion and terror. Detective Foster watched the broadcast from his desk, the cold coffee in his cup long forgotten. Chapter 3: Dead Ends in Desperation. November 20, 1968, Boston, Massachusetts. 5 days had passed since Laura Whitmore vanished, and the investigation was losing momentum under mounting pressure. Detective Raymond Foster sat in the cramped Dorchester precinct conference room, surrounded by exhausted officers and a wall of maps and photos that led nowhere. "Let's review," Foster rasped, voice hoarse from too many cigarettes. Richard Murphy vanished the same day as Laura. His apartment shows signs of a quick exit. We linked him to the note in Laura's coat, but we have no witnesses, no body, no trace. Detective Sarah Brennan added, nobody at the library saw them interact. Murphy kept to himself. Helen Henderson was right, he barely spoke to anyone. Officer McCarthy reported that Murphy had withdrawn $200 the day before Laura disappeared. No transaction since. Background? Asked Lieutenant Webb. Born in Portland, Maine. Parents died in a car crash when he was 19. Moved here in '65 to work at the library. Former colleagues described him as competent but intense, Foster said. It wasn't evidence, but it was all they had. The silence was heavy, they were out of leads, and Laura was running out of time. Then the phone rang. Officer DiNardo answered and passed it to Foster. On the other end was Doris Hartley, a librarian who had trained Murphy years before. Richard was peculiar, she said. After his parents died, he developed obsessions, watching female patrons, writing about them. It was unsettling, but never illegal. When he moved to Boston, I was relieved. Foster pressed further. Did Murphy have a hideout? Doris recalled a cabin near Sebago Lake in Maine. He said it was the only place he could be himself, she told him. That was the first real lead they'd had in days. Within hours, Foster coordinated with Maine authorities. By dawn on November 21, he and a joint task force were combing the remote forests around Sebago Lake. The first 2 cabins they checked were empty. The third, at the end of a snow-covered dirt road, showed signs of life. Tire tracks, a faint trail of smoke, a generator humming behind the building. Boston Police. Richard Murphy, come out with your hands visible. Foster shouted as officers surrounded the cabin. Silence. McCarthy eased the unlocked door open. The cabin was empty, but someone had been there recently. Food wrappers. A sleeping bag. Men's clothing. And on the mantel, a chilling photograph, Laura Whitmore leaving the library, shot with a telephoto lens. Dozens more photos were spread across a table, all of Laura, all taken without her knowledge. Jesus, McCarthy whispered. He was stalking her. Brennan found a journal on a desk. Inside were pages of obsessive entries, each one more delusional than the last. Murphy wrote of a destiny with Laura, his rage growing when she didn't respond to feelings that existed only in his imagination. The final entry, dated November 15, read. She refused to understand. I tried to explain, but she screamed. She tried to run. I couldn't let her leave. Everything I did was for us. She'll understand. We'll go somewhere new, somewhere they can't find us. Foster's stomach dropped. Laura had still been alive as of November 15, and Murphy planned to move her elsewhere. He's running, Foster said. He knows we'll find this place. We need alerts out, bus stations, train depots, border crossings. He's 6 days ahead, but traveling with Laura will slow him down. As officers coordinated with agencies across New England, Foster stared at the scattered photographs. Somewhere out there, Laura Whitmore was alive, trapped in the grip of a delusional man who believed their twisted story wasn't over. The chilling question that remained was simple: how much time did she have left? Chapter 4: The Trail Grows Cold. December 1968 to January 1969. Boston and beyond. The weeks after the discovery of Richard Murphy's cabin blurred into one long nightmare. False sightings, dead-end leads, and fading hope consumed the investigation. Detective Raymond Foster looked years older, his face etched with exhaustion. Each potential breakthrough dissolved into nothing. The Whitmores were unraveling. Margaret stopped eating, Thomas barely slept. They existed in limbo, unable to grieve, unable to hope. On December 3rd, a bus station attendant in Vermont claimed to see Murphy with a sickly young woman. Police arrived too late. On December 10th, a motel clerk in Albany reported a similar couple. Again, they were gone. On December 18th, a gas station owner in Pennsylvania swore he saw them. 3 days of searching turned up nothing. Each lead gave a flicker of hope, then crushed it. It seemed Laura was alive, but America was vast, and in 1968, 2 people who wanted to disappear could vanish easily. Foster worked 18-hour days, chasing every tip, coordinating with police across the country. But as weeks turned into months, resources thinned. Other cases demanded attention. Eventually, the department had to move on. In early February, Lieutenant Webb called Foster into his office. "Ray, you've done everything possible. 42 police departments, over 300 interviews. You need to step back." "Laura is still out there," Foster replied. "Maybe," Webb said quietly. "Or maybe she isn't. Maybe Murphy killed her the first day. Maybe they're in Mexico. We don't know, and we might never know. We have to shift this to a cold case." Foster wanted to argue but was too tired. He nodded silently. That evening, he visited the Whitmores. Margaret's face was hollow when she opened the door. "You haven't found her," she said flatly. Inside, Thomas sat motionless, staring into space. The house felt like a tomb. Foster explained gently, the case would stay open, but active investigation would scale back. Resources were gone. Only new evidence could change that. "You're giving up," Thomas whispered. "No, sir. I'll never give up. But without new leads, finding her gets harder every day." Margaret wept. Foster's own eyes burned. He had failed them. He had failed Laura. Before he left, Margaret asked, "Do you think she's still alive?" Foster had asked himself that countless times. Murphy's profile suggested he was obsessive and delusional, not necessarily violent. Laura could still be alive, hidden somewhere remote. But it was equally possible she had been dead since November 15th. "I don't know," Foster said honestly. "But if there's even the smallest chance, I'll find her. And if she's gone, I'll find who's responsible." On February 28, 1969, the case was officially declared cold. The bulging file, hundreds of pages of interviews, reports, and evidence, was boxed up and sent to the archives. Foster kept his own copies, refusing to let the case disappear from his life. Years passed. Foster solved other crimes, but Laura haunted every success. Occasionally, tips surfaced, Murphy in Ohio, Laura in Montana, but every lead ended in disappointment. They had vanished as if they never existed. Foster retired in 1985, still carrying the weight of failure. He handed his files to younger detectives, urging them to continue. But Laura had been missing for 17 years. The chances of finding her alive were almost non-existent. The case joined hundreds of other unsolved mysteries in the archives. Time moved on. Neighborhoods changed. The library where Laura had worked was renovated. Life erased the traces of what had happened. But Margaret and Thomas Whitmore never stopped waiting. They kept hoping for a knock on the door that never came. Margaret died in 1987, her last words, "Find Laura." Thomas followed in 1992, placing flowers on a grave that might never hold his daughter. In the small note, Tuesday, 8 p.m. You know where. RM remains sealed in an evidence bag, waiting for someone to decipher it. That someone wouldn't arrive for 34 more years. Chapter 5, The Digital Age and a Curious Intern. April 2023, Boston Police Department, Dorchester Precinct. The basement archives of the Boston Police Department had changed little in 55 years. The concrete walls were still the same dull gray, the fluorescent lights still buzzed and flickered, and the air still carried the heavy scent of dust and old paper. But one thing was very different, the mission. What was once a forgotten graveyard of case files had become the focus of a massive modernization effort, the digitization of every cold case in the department's history. Boxes of reports, photographs, and evidence logs from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were being scanned and uploaded into a digital archive, tedious, monotonous work left mostly to interns and junior staff who didn't realize that, in handling these forgotten records, they might stumble onto history. One such intern was Tyler Mitchell, 23 years old, freshly graduated from Northeastern University with a degree in criminal justice and ambitions of becoming a detective. The internship wasn't glamorous, just scanning page after page, labeling files, and sneezing from the dust, but Tyler approached it with earnest determination. Every document was a piece of a story, and he treated each one with respect. On April 17, 2023, Tyler rolled a cart of boxes from 1968 to his desk. He'd already digitized 17 cases that morning, robberies, assaults, fraud, when one label stopped him. Box hashtag 68-442, Whitmore, Laura, missing person. He opened it carefully. Inside were hundreds of pages, witness statements, police reports, photographs, transcripts, forensic logs, all meticulously compiled over months of investigation. As Tyler worked through them, he found himself pulled deeper into the story, a young librarian who vanished, a suspect named Richard Murphy, a manhunt that stretched across states, and then, abruptly, the trail went cold. The final page was dated February 28, 1969, the day the case was officially closed as unsolved. Tyler's attention caught on one detail, an inventory line listing one handwritten note found in victim's coat pocket. Flipping through the file, he found a black and white photograph of it. Tuesday, 8 p.m. You know where. RM. The investigators had concluded it was a planned meeting between Laura and Murphy, likely on the Tuesday before she vanished. But Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that the interpretation was too neat. What if they had misunderstood? What if where wasn't a meeting point at all, but a threat? During his lunch break, Tyler searched the case online. It had become a true crime staple, debated in podcasts and forums. The theories were always the same: Murphy killed Laura and hid the body, or abducted her and kept her captive. But none of the discussions focused on the note, and none mentioned that the original evidence still existed. The note, labeled item hashtag 68-442E7, was still stored in a climate-controlled facility in Quincy. That afternoon, Tyler approached his supervisor, Detective Lisa Chen, a seasoned investigator overseeing the digitization project. "Detective, has anyone ever re-examined the note from the Whitmore case?" he asked. Chen looked up. "Not since the 60s. Why?" In 1968, they could only do basic handwriting comparison. Now we have software that analyzes pressure, speed, even emotional state. We can extract DNA from touch evidence. We could know so much more. Chen studied him. "You want to reopen a 55-year-old piece of evidence? I want to see if the original investigation missed something. What if Tuesday isn't the day before the disappearance? What if where isn't a location Laura knew, but one he chose?" After a long pause, Chen nodded. "Write me a memo, what to test, why it matters, and how it could change the case. If it's solid, I'll take it to the lieutenant. Tyler threw himself into the task. For 3 days he read every page of the file, building timelines, plotting maps, and analyzing Murphy's psychology. And then, buried in a witness statement from November 1968, he noticed something investigators had dismissed. A neighbor had mentioned that Murphy's cousin, Robert Mallory, occasionally visited. Police had interviewed Mallory, but his alibi checked out, and the lead was dropped. But Tyler knew something the original detectives didn't. Robert Mallory's initials were also RM. He dug deeper. Mallory's family owned a warehouse near the Dorchester waterfront, and used for decades. What if the note wasn't from Murphy at all? What if it was Mallory who had written it, lured Laura, and orchestrated the abduction, and Murphy, upon discovering the truth, fled out of fear or guilt? It would explain why Murphy had left behind incriminating journals and photographs rather than destroying them. Maybe they weren't a confession, maybe they were a warning. Tyler's memo outlined a bold theory: Richard Murphy might not have been the kidnapper. He might have been a witness, or even an unwilling accomplice. And the real suspect could be a man no one had ever truly investigated. Detective Chen read the memo twice and called Tyler into her office. "This is impressive," she said. "I'm taking it to Lieutenant Morrison." The next morning, Chen sat across from Lieutenant James Morrison, a 35-year veteran known for his skepticism but fairness. She laid out the theory, showing him the evidence Tyler had pieced together. Morrison listened silently, then picked up the phone. "This is Lieutenant Morrison, Dorchester Precinct. I need a full evidence retrieval, case #68-442, Laura Whitmore. Everything." He hung up and turned to Chen. "If your intern is right, and we can tie Robert Mallory to this case after 55 years, this will be the biggest cold case breakthrough in Boston history. If he's wrong, we've lost some time. Either way, the Whitmores deserve answers." And just like that, the investigation that had lain dormant since 1969 stirred back to life. What began as a routine digitization project had become something far more significant. Tyler Mitchell, a young intern scanning dusty boxes, had potentially cracked open one of Boston's most haunting mysteries. But as Chen reminded him with a measured smile, "If we're reopening this case, Tyler, the easy part is over. The real work starts now." Chapter 6, Evidence Re-Examined. May 2023, Boston Police Department, Forensic Sciences Unit. The evidence boxes from the Laura Whitmore case arrived like relics from another century. Detective Lisa Chen, intern Tyler Mitchell, and 3 seasoned detectives gathered in the conference room as the seals were broken for the first time in 55 years. Inside were objects frozen in time: Laura's navy coat, faintly carrying the scent of that November night, her torn handbag with its scattered contents, and, in a small envelope marked #68-442E7, the infamous note. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, the department's lead forensic document examiner, handled the note with surgical precision. Under magnification, she studied the pencil lines with tools unavailable in 1968. "The paper's aged, but it's intact," she noted. "Let's start with handwriting." Modern software analyzed every curve and pressure point, comparing them to known samples from Richard Murphy, journals, catalog cards, letters. 2 hours later, Okonkwo frowned. "This doesn't match Murphy," she said, pointing to the overlaid analysis. "His writing slants forward with tight spacing. This writer's letters are upright and looser. Even the capital T formation is different. I'd say there's less than a 30% chance Murphy wrote this." Tyler's heart raced. His theory was no longer speculation. "Can we compare it to Robert Mallory's writing?" Chen asked. "If you get me samples, yes," Okonkwo replied. That night, Chen and Detective Marcus Williams searched the Massachusetts archives. They found Mallory's marriage certificate, 1967, driver's license application, 1966, and a written complaint, 1968, all bearing his handwriting. The next morning, Okonkwo examined the new material. By afternoon, she had her conclusion: an 85 to 90% probability that Robert Mallory wrote the note. The room crackled with renewed energy. If Mallory wrote it, Williams said, our original theory collapses. Murphy might not have been the perpetrator at all. Or he played a different role, Tyler added. Maybe he found out and ran, out of fear, or loyalty. The team began reviewing the case with new eyes. Tyler pulled up property records. Mallory's family owned a warehouse at 347 Harbor Street. He had access to it in 1968. It was sold in 1989 and demolished in the 2000s. It's now a residential complex. Chen's frustration was palpable. If the warehouse had been a crime scene, any trace of evidence was long gone. But Dr. Okonkwo had another idea. We can still test the note for touch DNA, she said. Skin cells left behind decades ago might still yield genetic material. It was a long shot, but their best one. The note was sent to the Massachusetts State Police. DNA lab results would take weeks. While they waited, Chen decided it was time to speak with Robert Mallory directly. They tracked him to Sunrise Senior Living in Quincy, a peaceful retirement home, hardly the place one expected to find a man possibly tied to a half-century-old abduction. On May 19, 2023, Chen and Williams entered the common room. Mallory, now 83, sat near a window in a wheelchair, his frail hands curled around the armrests. When they introduced themselves, a flicker, fear, guilt, maybe relief, crossed his faded blue eyes. Mr. Mallory, Chen began, we're here about November 1968, your cousin, Richard Murphy, and a woman named Laura Whitmore. Mallory was silent for a long time. Then, in a thin, raspy voice, he said, I wondered when you'd come. 55 years. I thought I'd die before anyone figured it out. Chen's breath caught. Mr. Mallory, I need to read you your rights. I know my rights. I've been waiting for this, he said, almost calmly. When the formalities were complete, Chen placed a recorder on the table. Tell us what happened to Laura Whitmore. Mallory's eyes drifted shut, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. I saw her at the library. She was kind. Beautiful. I was 28, rough, invisible to women like her. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I wrote that note and slipped it into her coat, hoping she'd come. And she did, Tuesday, November 12th. But when she realized why I'd asked her there, she panicked. She said she didn't know me, that I was scaring her. She ran before I could explain. But she disappeared on the 15th, Chen pressed. What happened then? Mallory's face crumpled. She told Richard. She figured out we were cousins. She asked if I was dangerous. Richard confronted me, furious. Said I'd ruin his life. He threatened to go to the police. So you killed Laura to silence her, Chen said quietly. No. Mallory's voice cracked. After a coughing fit, he whispered, I didn't kill Laura. But I know who did. The room fell silent. Richard killed her, Mallory said flatly. He told me if she went to the police, they'd investigate us both. They'd find out about my assault conviction in 1964, 8 months in jail for a bar fight. He said they'd assume I'd kidnapped her. So he'd make sure she never talked. Where's Laura Whitmore? Williams asked. I don't know. Richard said he handled it, that I should never ask and he'd never tell. He left Boston that day. I never saw him again. The confession was not the ending they hoped for, but it was a breakthrough. The man once thought to be a footnote was now tied directly to the abduction. And the man long presumed guilty might have committed the ultimate crime after all. The next steps were clear: find evidence linking Richard Murphy to Laura's death, if any remained, and finally answer the question that had haunted Boston for more than half a century. Chapter 7, The Final Pieces. May, June 2023. Boston Police Department and beyond. Robert Mallory's confession exploded through the reopened investigation, rewriting the narrative from the ground up. Richard Murphy, once believed to be a deranged stalker, now appeared to have been a desperate man trying, in a twisted way, to protect his cousin and himself. But if Mallory was telling the truth, Murphy's protection had come at the ultimate cost, the life of Laura Whitmore. The new question was the most crucial of all: where was Laura's body, and where was Richard Murphy? "We need to find Murphy," Lieutenant Morrison said during an emergency briefing. "Mallory's an accessory, but Murphy committed the murder." Detective Marcus Williams displayed a timeline. Mallory says Murphy left Boston the day Laura vanished, November 15, 1968. "We know he went to the cabin in Maine, but the journals and photos we found there now look staged." Tyler Mitchell, now officially part of the investigative team, offered a theory: what if he wanted police to find that? If he left behind a fake trail, stalker notes, obsessive writing, it would distract investigators from the real motive, protecting his cousin. Chen nodded. "It's a classic misdirection. He takes the blame for being a stalker so no one suspects Mallory's involvement." But where had Murphy gone after Maine? Sightings across several states in late 1968 and early 1969 were revisited. One stood out: a December 3 report from Burlington, Vermont, describing Murphy with a sickly woman. At the time, police assumed it was Laura. But if Laura had already been killed, then who was the woman? Tyler asked quietly. No one had an answer. Morrison issued a national alert for Richard Murphy, now wanted for first-degree murder. If alive, he'd be 95, unlikely, but not impossible. If dead, there would be a record. Investigators combed through Social Security, death indexes, and federal databases. 3 days later, they found him. Richard Joseph Murphy, born March 17, 1938, had died on August 3, 2002, in Spokane, Washington, cause of death, emphysema. He had lived quietly under his own name, working as a janitor and living alone. He was hiding in plain sight, Williams muttered. In 2002, records weren't connected like today, Chin explained. By then, the case was forgotten. He slipped through the cracks. But Murphy's death meant no confession, no trial, and, worst of all, no answers about Laura's remains. Or so it seemed. Then the DNA results from the note arrived. Dr. Patricia Hernandez from the Massachusetts State Police Lab called with startling news. We recovered partial touch DNA. It's not Mallory's, it's a familial match. A close relative of Richard Murphy. A relative? Chin asked. He had no siblings. Then likely a child, Hernandez said. A new layer of the mystery unfolded. Digging into Spokane records, Tyler discovered that in 1985, Murphy had been listed as the father of a baby girl, Catherine Murphy, born to Diane Fletcher. Catherine, now 38, lived in Spokane and worked as a nurse. The DNA results suggested that Catherine's genetic material was on the note, something impossible in 1968. Which meant she must have handled the note after Murphy's death, likely while sorting his belongings. If she touched that note, Morrison said, there could be more. He may have kept evidence. Maybe even confessed. Chen and Williams flew to Spokane. Catherine Murphy greeted them at her modest home with surprising composure. Please, come in, she said. I've been waiting for this for 21 years. Sitting across from the detectives, Catherine told them everything. When my father died, I went through his apartment. He didn't own much. But there was a metal box in his closet, photos of a woman I didn't know, a disturbing journal, and a folded piece of paper with that note. And before he died, he told me something I've never forgotten. Her voice trembled. He said, I did something terrible when I was young. I thought I was protecting family, but I destroyed a family instead. When I'm gone, someone will come. Tell them the truth. Tell them where she is. Did he tell you where? Chin asked. Catherine nodded. Not her name. But he told me the location. He made me swear to remember. She unlocked her phone and handed it to Chen. On the screen was a note, dated August 2, 2002, the day before Murphy's death. The old warehouse foundation on Harbor Street in Boston. Dorchester District. We poured new concrete over the floor section near the back wall in November 1968 for repairs. She's underneath. Tell her family I'm sorry. Tell them I was weak and afraid, and I've paid for it every day of my life. R.J. Murphy. The room fell silent. Chen stared at the screen, barely breathing. After 55 years, the truth was finally within reach. Laura Whitmore, the missing librarian whose disappearance had haunted generations of detectives, had never left Boston. Her remains lay beneath a slab of concrete in a forgotten warehouse on Harbor Street, sealed beneath decades of history and guilt. The final chapter of the investigation was about to begin. Excavation orders were filed within hours. Crime scene units prepared for the delicate recovery operation. And as Chen looked out the airplane window on the flight back to Boston, she felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for months begin, just slightly, to lift. It wasn't closure. Not yet. But for the first time since November 15, 1968, the search for Laura Whitmore was no longer about questions. It was about answers. Chapter 8, Justice Delayed, Not Denied. July 2023, Boston, Massachusetts. The July sun beat down on Harbor Street as the excavation began. The apartment complex that now stood on the site of the old Mallory warehouse hid secrets beneath its parking lot, but ground-penetrating radar had confirmed what Richard Murphy's deathbed confession revealed: a section of the original foundation still lay buried, untouched since November 1968. Detective Lisa Chen stood behind the caution tape, her arms folded as she watched the work crews cut through asphalt. Reporters crowded the edge of the lot, microphones ready. Curious neighbors whispered in clusters. And among them was James Whitmore, 62 years old, nephew of Laura Whitmore. He had never met his aunt. She vanished before he was born, but her absence had shaped his family like a shadow. When Chen explained the risks, James only nodded. After 55 years, he said, we just need the truth. For 2 days, crews dug. First came the asphalt, then compacted soil, then the cracked outlines of the old foundation walls. On the third day, they found it, a patch of concrete poured later, its texture and color distinct. Slowly, with hand tools and small pneumatic drills, they opened the slab. Beneath lay a shallow depression lined with a rotted tarp. Inside were skeletal remains. The work site fell silent. Even the reporters stopped speaking. Dr. Michael Chen, a forensic anthropologist, examined the bones carefully. Female, 25 to 30. Height consistent with Whitmore's records. Blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. He paused. I'll need DNA to be sure, but everything here fits. This is almost certainly Laura Whitmore. Lisa Chen felt a surge of conflicting emotions: triumph at solving the mystery, grief at the confirmation of Laura's fate. Justice had finally arrived, but 55 years too late. 2 weeks later, DNA testing against James Whitmore's sample gave final confirmation. The medical examiner's report ruled Laura's death a homicide, caused by blunt trauma to the skull. Accountability at last. In August 2023, Robert Mallory, 83 and frail, was formally charged with conspiracy and accessory to murder. Given his age, declining health, and partial cooperation, the district attorney sought a plea bargain. Mallory would plead guilty and spend the rest of his life under custody in a medical unit. On September 15, 2023, Mallory appeared in Suffolk County Superior Court. The gallery was packed: journalists, amateur sleuths, and surviving friends of the Whitmore family. James Whitmore sat in the front row, his wife gripping his hand. When asked for a statement, Mallory struggled to stand. His voice was weak but clear. I didn't kill Laura Whitmore, but I caused her death. My cousin Richard struck the blow, but I'm the reason she was there. I stayed silent for decades because I was ashamed. I let her family suffer without answers. I am sorry to them, and to her memory. I will carry that shame until I die. Tears streaked his lined face. The judge sentenced him to 8 to 10 years, a symbolic term, effectively a life sentence for a dying man. Mallory was escorted out in a wheelchair, his confession echoing through the hushed courtroom. Closure, at last. Outside the courthouse, James Whitmore told reporters. My grandmother always believed the truth would surface. She died waiting, but she was right. Today, we finally know. He later confided to Detective Chen. We can bury her now. We can give her the dignity she was denied. On October 15, 2023, Laura Whitmore was laid to rest at Cedar Grove Cemetery in Dorchester, alongside her parents and sister. More than 100 mourners attended, relatives, retired officers, librarians who remembered her, even true crime followers who had tracked the case for years. Detective Chen and Tyler Mitchell stood together at the graveside as the casket was lowered. I read Foster's letters to the Whitmore family, Tyler whispered. He never stopped believing this case would be solved. I wish he could see this. Chen nodded. He didn't live to see it, but his faith carried the torch. In a way, he's here too. James Whitmore approached, holding a framed photograph of Laura, the same portrait that had sat on Foster's desk for decades. He placed it gently on the casket. For my aunt, he said softly. And for everyone who never stopped looking. Epilogue. The Whitmore case, once thought unsolvable, was finally closed. The record now bore the words, "Case solved, offender deceased." Justice had not come swiftly, but it had come. For Lisa Chen, it was a reminder of why cold cases mattered. For Tyler Mitchell, it was proof that even the smallest detail could change history. And for the Whitmore family, it was the end of a silence that had lasted more than half a century. Laura Whitmore's story became a symbol in Boston, that truth may be buried, but it is never destroyed. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is simply justice, waiting to be found.